of course, the staff and the Board of Education for what will be an informative and enlightening afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pat Mandenberg, and I serve as chairperson for the Hazlitt Coordinating Council, which of course is our district school improvement committee. Before I introduce Dr. Bennett, our guest today, I would briefly like to give you some background as to how we all ended up here. We are here for what I see as two reasons. First, we are here because one of our long-term district school improvement goals commits the district to study, define, plan, and implement diversity in all aspects of the school district. And let me tell you how that goal came about. As you know, the state requires us as a district to set long-term school improvement goals. As a result of that requirement, 2 years ago, DCC thought that it made sense to choose diversity as one of those goals. Diversity is a burning national issue. We have heard that in Hazlitt we haven't done the kinds of things that we need to do to address this issue, and so that it just made sense for DCC to explore diversity and commit us to that goal. Secondly, we're here because it's important for us to be here as educators. As educators, we are charged to prepare our students to effectively function in a world and a workplace that is quickly becoming more and more culturally diverse. America has always been a diverse country, the melting pot nation. However, in recent times, people have not chosen to melt into the whole, but retain a unique cultural identity. Further, as I was listening to NPR this morning on the radio, I was reminded of another two ways why we need to think about preparing our students for their future. The GATT Treaty this morning was signed by President Clinton while he was on his way to the summit of the Americas. Truly, the world is shrinking, and our students need to function in this new world marketplace. Last year, HCC, charged with this long-term goal, wrestled with the issue for most of the year. Defining diversity to meet Hazlitt's needs was not an easy task. And then writing goals and strategy for the district for the next 5 years was an enormous task that required meeting after meeting of thought-provoking searching and refining. We came up with 5 goals, which include instituting foreign language programs, within school improvement plans, every building addressing the contributions of all peoples and curriculum issues, recruiting qualified individuals as staff, allocating money, and raising the level of awareness of our staff. And that is why we are here today. This past summer, Jean Friends, Patty Lutsky, and I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Milton Bennett at the Educational Leadership Conference, which was held at the MAC. The Diversity Subcommittee, which has come out of HCC, met and discussed some ways that we can begin to develop a staff program. Dr. Bennett came immediately to our minds. We were impressed with his message, as well as his ability to make us laugh and make us think. We are pleased and honored that he could be with us here today. As an educator, Dr. Bennett created the graduate program in intercultural communication at Portland State University, where he was a faculty member for 15 years. As a consultant, he facilitates professional development in intercultural relations for university faculty and administrators, corporate executives and managers, social service personnel, and others in the public and private sector. He is founder of the Intercultural Communication Institute, and he sponsors the annual Summer Institute for Intercultural Communication, which draws nearly 600 faculty and participants from throughout the U.S. and abroad. Currently, he is the Director of Graduate Studies for the new Individualized Masters of Arts in Intercultural Relationship Program offered jointly by ICI and the McGregor School of Antioch University. He's written numerous chapters and journal articles on developmental approaches to increasing intercultural sensitivity and is co-author of the revised edition of American Cultural Patterns. We are pleased to have Dr. Bennett with us today speaking on the topic of Beyond Tolerance, an intercultural approach to diversity. And he also wanted me to tell you that we will, at some point, be having a 15-minute break so that you can pace yourselves. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Milton Bennett?
Thank you. That was very brave. Could we, hello. Okay, could we get the lights up just a little bit in the house, please? Ah, there you are. Okay, good. Thanks. The topic, of course, is diversity, and some of you may be wondering already, what's a white guy up there doing talking about diversity? This topic has become a topic of specialization in many cases for people of color or those who have minority status in this society. And in my opinion, and the opinion I think of many others, that's not the way it ought to be. That living in this kind of a society is everybody's business, and particularly it probably is the business of those of us who have enjoyed dominant cultural status in this society through various accidents of history. Those of us who are European American in our ethnic descent have found ourselves in a dominant position in this society, and therefore we are the ones who are least likely to have thought through what it means to live in a multicultural society. Those who are already minorities in this society have probably spent a lot more time thinking about that, and that's why a white guy is up here talking about this subject. I think that we can all be thinking about what does it mean to live in this kind of a multicultural society. I mean, this is where we're going. There is no chance that we are retreating from the direction which was specified so nicely by Pat, the direction of moving towards a celebration of our diversity. And the reason that I believe that there is no retreat from this is that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon. I spend a lot of time outside of the U.S. Talking to people both in Japan and some other Asian countries and also in European countries, and I find that in all of these places the issue of diversity, of multiculturalism, of how do we deal with diversity in our own societies is paramount. I believe that this is a phenomenon which will only grow in the near future. So coupled with this multiculturalism, the domestic issues of diversity, we have the international global village in which we're all living, and which of course is not going to go away either, which leads us of course to the issue of how are we going to live in that society? What can we do? And when we look to the past for answers, when we look and we say, well, maybe there was some time before when we knew how to do this, we see a rather dismal record. I believe that traditionally our attitude towards difference, people who are different from ourselves, was to avoid them. Go the other direction as quickly as possible. This maybe is traced back to our primate ancestors, if you can imagine a group of them sitting around the fire gnawing on whatever it is that they just caught that day, and they look up, and over the hill comes this other little group of primates. Now, how do you suspect that first little group is going to look up at the other group and go, ah, diversity? Isn't it wonderful? Come on down and join us at the fire here. We'll eat this together. Probably not. Probably they were out of there, going the other direction as fast as they could. And I think that we have inherited this tendency, which, who knows, at some time may in fact have served some survival potential for us, diversifying the gene pool or whatever. Now, this exact same tendency, this ability, this tendency that we have to avoid difference, to run away from it, is in itself, as we all know, suicidal. At least it does not serve our survival in any way whatsoever. There's no place to hide. As one of your faculty members mentioned, you can run, but you can't hide. And that's the way things are going. Well, traditionally, if we have, when we're unable to avoid difference, that is, we're thrust into contact with difference, then we try to convert people to be like us. you see, and then they're not going to be different anymore, and then it's okay to be around them. This, of course, was the basis of the melting pot idea, that somehow there would be some kind of a standard. The melting pot, has come to mean the melting of diversity, but the origin of the term melting pot was really the idea that there would be some kind of a standard that everybody would meet. The term was actually coined by a fellow named Zangwill, and popularized here in the United States anyway, who wrote a play called The Melting Pot back in the early part of this century. And it was about European immigrants. And it was filled with various statements, one of which I've memorized, which is, "Bring me your many peoples of Europe with their 50 languages and their 50 histories, and we will melt them down in God's crucible, the great melting pot, out of which will emerge a new super race of beings, the Americans." See, kind of a Nazi idea, basically, which, was kind of picked up a little bit later in the century. But what happened is that this super race of beings began to be associated with a particular type of being that became the standard American, somebody who looked a whole bunch like me, kind of white and kind of male. And there were folks all the way along who said, thanks anyway, but we just as soon not match that standard. And so the melting pot, probably we remember it a bit more fondly, some people do, than it ever worked. I mean, it actually probably didn't work all that well. There are lots of people, as you suggested, that never did melt down, and we're just sort of noticing that now. Well, if we try to avoid people, but we can't, and then if we try to convert them to be like us, and we can't, then we kill them. This has been our history of dealing with diversity. You don't have to look very far to find genocide occurring at this instant. And we need not look very far back in the history of this society to see genocide being practiced in physical termination of entire groups of people. You could argue that you can kill people in ways other than physically terminating their existence. We can kill people's potential. We do that a lot in organizations. We bring people into organizations, and we say we want to give you, a chance, an opportunity, and then we say, now that you're here, act just like us. and then we find out that there's a glass ceiling here, and we can't go any further. This is a way of killing people's potential. I have a friend of mine who calls it depotentiating people. Isn't that a nice word, depotentiating? And you can think of some organizations as being depotentiating organizations in the sense that they kill people's ability to operate effectively in those organizations. Well, that's been our history, I believe. And some people say, well, what we should do is we should just tolerate people. If we only had more tolerance, things would be okay. I shared with a couple of you before, but I'll repeat for the rest of you. I had a student come to me a little while ago and say that her goal in a class, it was a class on relationships, her goal in this class was to learn how to become more tolerant of her husband. I said, well, how long have you been married? She said 9 years, and we're beginning to have some troubles. I think I need to become more tolerant. So we said, well, let's try that out. Let's say you go out for your 10th wedding anniversary. You're sitting there, the candlelight and the wine, everything's really nice. You turn to your husband and you say, honey, I just want to tell you it's been a great 10 years. I've learned to tolerate you. See, you find out, some of you know, that doesn't work very well. Yeah, you don't make points for that. She said, well, yeah, that's right. What I want to really be able to say is that I accept him. I need to accept him more. So we said, well, let's try that out. Honey, it's been a great 10 years. I've come to accept you. Probably not exactly a point getter either. She said, well, that's right. I really need to be able to say, I appreciate you. And we said, yeah, now we're getting to it. We're talking about something like appreciation or respect here. I'd like to suggest to you that in this multicultural society, it's kind of like we're married to each other. It's like, here we are, And, here we are different from one another, and yet in a relationship, which could be a really good relationship if we figure out how to deal with it appropriately. And probably it is insufficient for us to simply be tolerant of one another. I believe that we need to be able to appreciate the fact that we're different. We need to be able to say to one another, we are better off together with our differences than we would be apart. We're better off together with our differences than we would be apart. That's what that woman needed to be able to say to her husband, and I think that's what we need to be able to say to one another in this kind of a society, that we are better off with our diversity than we would be without it. Now, some approaches that have been taken in communities and in schools to try to deal with this issue of diversity and difference have, in many ways, helped to create some problems in addition to solving some problems. One of the approaches that's been taken is a kind of legal approach, which is to point out that there are examples of sexism or sexual harassment, that there is racial discrimination, certainly true in both cases, and that the appropriate remedy for this is to tell people their legal rights and to encourage people to use the legal system to remedy this situation. This is, we call it, not surprisingly, a legal approach. Now, this is fine. I think people need to understand what the law is, and in many ways, this kind of an approach tells people how far they can go. It sets some boundaries on behavior. However, it tells people what not to do. It doesn't tell people what to do. It sets up a kind of negative climate. It doesn't really contribute much to living in this kind of multicultural marriage that I'm suggesting here. I've seldom seen anybody say, you know, one of the reasons why I really like having you around here is that I know you can sue me. This is not something that contributes to the building of constructive, positive relationships. So while we need to know that stuff, while we need to know the law, if that's all we do, if all we do is tell each other what the law is here, I think that we have sold ourselves short. We have not provided ourselves with the kind of tools we need to live in this kind of a society, to have this kind of marriage. Another approach that's been taken is the kind of isms approach, which is to note that there is sexism, there is racism, there is homophobia, there are other examples of ways in which our society has taught us to hate people. You know, it's one of the things that societies do, is they teach you who to hate. For a long time it was the Russians, you remember. Now we don't have to hate the Russians anymore, I guess. So we're looking around for somebody else to hate. Yeah. Japanese are in contention, I think, for that. Particularly around here, I guess, you know, they're a good target. Yeah. But we're also taught who to hate within our own society, and we need to be aware of this. We need to be aware of the ways in which these isms, the sexism and racism and other kinds of isms, have affected our mentality. We've simply been trained that here's who it is that we should be directing this hatred towards. You see, we need to know that. However, that in itself is insufficient to help us build relationships. People do not say, you know, one of the reasons that I really like having you around is because I know you think I'm a racist. You see, this does not build, again, positive relationships. It's something we need to know. It's something we need to attend to. It's something that needs to be addressed, but in and itself does not build relationships. And the final approach that people have taken is targeting the dominant group for change. And this generally takes the form of white males. You've had it your way long enough. We're here to take over, you know, whoever the we is. Now, this is a tempting approach, of course. At least my wife tells me, you know, that she finds this a kind of tempting thing to do. But of course, in any society, white males are going to be part of that society. You know, while whites in general are going to fall into a minority in this culture, or at least less than a majority, probably by the year 2050 or a bit after that, white males, and you know, whites in general, but white males specifically, are going to continue to be an important part of this society. So we need to figure out some way of approaching this kind of multicultural marriage in a way that includes that group. Not in any kind of particularly privileged status, but that nevertheless includes them as part of this mix. Otherwise, we get what the well-known backlash. And you're going to get some of that anyway, but if we don't attend to inclusiveness, we're going to get a lot more of it. So we suggest this approach that we call an intercultural approach. The intercultural approach is one that is based more on what to do than rather what not to do. And one of the things that we need to understand what to do, is to understand the idea of culture. We believe that by understanding our own culture and by understanding others' cultures, that it gives us an idea of how to build positive relationships rather than telling us what not to do. So if you look at the little handout that I gave you, on the first page of that, we can get started on this topic. The first page of it is called Understanding Culture. Everybody have one of these? Okay. At the top there, you'll see a rather straightforward definition of culture: learned and shared values, beliefs, and behaviors of a group of interacting people. This can be boiled down to even a simpler statement, which is folks who hang out together tend to generate culture. So if you spend more time with some group, it tends to generate this pattern of behavior and beliefs and values, which can be described in many cases. And the most obvious case of that is national culture. Mexicans spend more time with other Mexicans than they do with Japanese people. They spend more time watching Mexican television, reading Mexican newspapers than they do watching Japanese television, and therefore, what do you know? You get the maintenance of something like Mexican national culture. Now, that doesn't mean all Mexicans are the same, of course. There's lots of variety, lots of diversity within Mexican culture. It's just that Mexicans look more like one another than they look like Japanese people anyway, and so forth for Nigerians and other sorts of national cultural groups, including Americans, or as we say about ourselves around Canadians, U.S. Americans. And sometimes, as you know, the Canadians get upset about us claiming this Italian sailor's name. So what we do instead is we call ourselves U.S. Americans, you know, and it's kind of a nifty term, actually. I sort of like it. So anyway, but U.S. American, it's a cultural group, you know, and a lot of times Americans don't think they have a culture. You ask Americans, you know, do you have? They say, no, yeah, I'm just an individual, you know, Heinz 57, something like that. It's amazing. Yeah. Of course, everybody else in the world knows that Americans are Americans. If you travel outside the United States, people go, oh, there goes an American, you see. And actually, one of the things that kids learn on these study abroad programs, one of the main things they learn, according to the research that we do, is that they learn that they are Americans. They realize for the first time that they are being perceived in a particular way by people out there in the rest of the world. And in fact, whenever you hear somebody say, other people in the world, when they hear somebody say, I don't have a culture, they go, oh, it's an American. Because only Americans say that. So one of the most American things about Americans is that they do not think that they are Americans. Odd notion. But I mean, it's a place to start here, you know, which is to recognize that there is, in fact, a unifying culture. Back in the late 60s, there were a lot of us went back to find our roots. Roots. This was, you remember, it was popularized by Alex Haley, and it was about African Americans finding their roots in Africa. But you didn't have to be black. You could be an Irish American and go back and find your roots in Ireland, or find your roots in Scotland, or find your roots in Puerto Rico, wherever it is that that your ancestors came from. And so a lot of us did that. We went back and we were expecting to find our people, you see. And what happened is, to a person, this is what happened. People said, you know, very nice that your ancestors came from here, but now you're an American. This was shocking. It was shocking to people who felt that they would have more in common with those ancestors than they had with other Americans. But it's not true. There is a commonality to the experience of living in this national culture, which gives us a unique character relative to other national cultures, even though we have all this diversity within ourselves. We need to remember that, because when we start talking about all these other kinds of diversity, sometimes we forget that there is also this unifying experience which provides us with the ability to come up with some common goals, to work together for the things that are in our national interest. That this idea is not necessarily at war with the notion of ethnicity. Some people think that if you have ethnic differences, you can't have national culture. I personally think this is the inability to hold two ideas simultaneously. This is actually rather easy to think, oh, and we got both of those things. You know, we have a national culture, if we look at it at that level. We also have our ethnic differences, if we look at it in that way. And we also have a lot of other differences. We'll go over here in a moment. The ethnic groups, the current terms that are in most popular use, African American. On the West Coast, Hispanic American, although in many cases, alternatively, this is Latino or Chicano, Chicana. Native American, although it's alternatively American Indian, or particular groups like Warm Springs or something. Asian American. These are broad groups, you see. And European American. Now, I mentioned European American already. It's the ethnicity of white people. A lot of white people don't think they're ethnic. They think everybody else is ethnic. White people are, well, kind of standard. Deviation from which constitutes ethnicity. So you go out to eat ethnic food, you generally do not go out to eat white people's food. Isn't that right? What is white people's food? Yeah. It's hamburgers. Yeah. So my wife grew up as a Catholic, and she thinks it's macaroni and cheese. You know, it's white people's food. You know, could be maybe fish sticks or another possibility, I guess. You know, but it's interesting, isn't it, that when we think of ethnic, we don't think about white people. And I think this is an error. This is a mistake, because there is that pernicious assumption then that white people are somehow standard and other people deviate from that standard in some fashion. This is not at all the case. In fact, white people bring their ethnic heritage in exactly the same way that everybody else in the society brings an ethnic heritage. It just so happens that white people, by and large, bring a heritage from Europe. North, south, east, west, one generation, many generations. You see, this is a pretty broad category, but at the same time, so is African American, you see. One generation, 20 generations from all over the place in Africa, or the diaspora through the Caribbean and other places, you see. So it's not a broader category really than African American or Asian American. Think of that, you know. Think of all the stuff that we throw into that category, you know. Koreans and Japanese and Filipinos and, you know, and even Indians, you know, South Asian Indians. You know, we throw into the category Asian American. So this is kind of a parallel category. I like to think of defining European American ethnicity as sort of leveling the ethnic playing field. It's not like you've got those ethnic groups against the whites. It's that it's all of us ethnic groups here, you see, living in this multicultural society. And we need to understand what that ethnicity is and how these ethnicities go together to build the American cultural experience. That's the task, I think, that we have ahead of us here in the next few years as we figure out how to live in this kind of a society. The other thing you may notice about these terms is that they stress culture and not color. In other words, these terms are not about race. Let me say something about race. Race is important, but it's not important for the reason that we frequently think it is. Race is important because people attach stereotypes to it. So people see a visible difference, like skin color or eye folds or something like that, and they go, oh, okay, we know about those people. Well, in fact, of course, you don't. That people don't behave the way they do because of their race. Maybe people stereotype people because of racial characteristics, but people, in fact, do not behave the way they do. Just because you're black, for instance, does not make you African American. You know, talk to many people from the Caribbean or from Africa who also are black who think you do not identify with African American culture. And in fact, many Americans who are black do not themselves identify with African American culture. And just because you're white, of course, doesn't make you American or European American, does it? You know, you can be white and be German. You see? So these racial categories are not very useful for doing the kind of multicultural work that we need to be doing. We need to attend to race because it continues to be a problem in social stereotyping. But outside of that, we need to be thinking beyond race and into culture. That's the way this issue is working. And I believe that I'm hearing that more and more across the country now. People are saying racial characteristics never was such a great idea in the first place, and it's becoming more and more clear now that we need to be dropping these categories and talking about, not because we're all the same, but talking about our differences in terms of culture rather than color. Another kind of culture here. Anybody here from the west coast of the U.S.? Anybody around? Some, yeah? Do you think it's a different culture than this Michigan culture here, as far as you know? Yeah? Probably everybody else thinks so too, right? You know, and say, oh, there's one of those West Coast people. They're so slow, you know, right? Yeah. Yeah. These are regional differences. The people on the East Coast spend more time with other people on the East Coast than they do with people on the West Coast of the U.S. and vice versa. And so we develop these kind of regional cultural patterns. We even have jokes about one another. So people back on the West Coast, they tell jokes, you know, about the East Coast. They say things like, you know about the guy from Portland. That's where I'm from. From Portland, Oregon, who was in New York. Been there a couple days. Went up to somebody and said, "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me what time it is, or should I just go screw myself?" These are the kind of jokes that people on the West Coast tell about. No. Well, stereotyping, I guess. We should be careful about that. Of course, everybody knows that California is a different culture. If you're from Northern California, you think Southern California is a different culture. I bet you in this state there are differences between the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state, are there not? And that cities within the state have different cultures as well. And would it be fair to say that the culture of East Lansing is different than the culture of Ann Arbor, or even just Lansing, right? Yeah, yeah. When I was in the Peace Corps, which I was for a couple of years, a long time ago, I lived on this little island out in Micronesia in the Western Pacific, Truck District. So you get a gold star if you know where that is. And I lived on this little island called Uman, 1 square mile. Had a little mountain in the middle of it. 1,600 people lived on this island. It's kind of crowded. 1,600 people lived around the outside of this island. I lived in the south end of the island, so I'd been there a couple months, and I said to the people I lived with, I'm going to walk up to the other end of the island. They said, "Be careful." I said, "What? This is a half a mile away on this little bitty island." They said, "Yeah, those are North Island people up there, though. We're South Island people, and they're different than we are. You got to watch out for them." Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, how we sort of divide ourselves up into these, regional cultural groups. But the lesson there is that the reason that we do that is exactly the same thing that's going on around ethnic or national cultural differences, and that is people who are spending more time with one another generates this kind of culture. It's interesting. We can study it in the same way, causes some of the same difficulties, actually. Gender is another one. There's males and females are of different cultures. I mean, this may have leaped into some of your observation. There's a book out now which is quite nice called "You Just Don't Understand" by a woman named Deborah Tannen, which explores this idea. My wife gave it to me to read, and I think it's really an interesting book, and I gave it back to her. She reads it. She read it as well, and so now we have these very, very efficient arguments, and she has her degree in communication as well. And so what happens when both people have the degrees in communication? It's not that they don't argue, it's that they have really complicated arguments. We both know how to talk about these communication things. Let's process this. So what happens is, rather than having these long, drawn-out arguments, I can say to her, "Page 23." And she can say, "Page 18," back. Yeah, all right, so it's fun. It's a nice book, but basically it's pointing out, and with some examples I'll be giving you in a moment, it's pointing out some differences in gender that can be seen as cultural differences, that cross-gender communication between males and females can be seen as cross-cultural communication. So forth for socioeconomic class. This is, I know, shocking, but rich people spend more time with other rich people than they do with poor people. And this tends to generate socioeconomic class culture and so forth. Religion, age. It's why, why your students or your kids see you as aliens and why you see them as aliens, because we have different generational cultures. And why? Because people are spending more time with one another. Physical ability is important. Folks who are, particularly deaf folks, have quite a well-developed culture. But other groups that have various forms of different physical ability can sometimes form their own groups, including TABs. That's what disabled folks call the able-bodied folks. You know what it stands for, TAB? Temporarily able-bodied. Well, not too many of you over 40, I see, out there. All right. Yeah. Sexual orientation. This is a hot issue in Oregon, as it is in some other places in the country, of course, where people get exercised in various ways about the religious or moral dimensions of what kind of sex people ought to have. And without stepping on people's toes, a way to be respectful of folks who do have a different sexual orientation, and there are a lot of people around, would be to say, well, this is also a culture. And despite whatever you might think about, some sexual orientation in terms of moral or religious principles, the fact is here's a group of people who spends more time with one another than they do probably with straight people. And that generates a culture which can be dealt with and respected as a culture and which has a contribution to make. And you don't need to look far to see the contributions that are made by people who affiliate with gay, lesbian, bisexual, or other kinds of sexual orientation cultures. Let me say one more thing about that. I spend a lot of time in corporations where I'm out there, talking about this changing workforce, and I've got to tell you that sexual orientation is a non-issue in corporations. Basically, people say, look, we're here to make a profit, and if some people here have a different sexual orientation, then we better damn well figure out how to be respectful of these groups so that we can communicate together so that we can get the job done that we need to have done. And so a lot of the political and religious stuff that gets associated with this issue in communities and in schools, which tend to be lightning rods for this community issue, tend not to exist in corporations. So insofar as we think part of our goal is to prepare students to go out and work in that kind of a work world, maybe we should be preparing them for the idea that this is really not much of an issue, out there in the corporations. All right. And of course, corporate culture, departmental culture, teacher culture, what do you know? Teachers, accountants, have their own culture and things like that. Yeah. What else do you think belongs on this list if we were to put something else on this culture list? What else do you think should go on there? Let me see your hand. What else? Yeah. Mental disabilities as well as physical ability. Yeah, sure. And again, same rationale. You got people who are spending more time with one another, generates a kind of culture. Okay, what else do you think could go on this list? Yeah. Vegetarians. Could well be, particularly if you're such a strong vegetarian that you just can't stand being around people who smell like carnivores. And so you spend all of your time with other people who are vegetarians. Then you start getting a culture. It's like golf culture, right? Just because you play golf doesn't mean you belong to golf culture. But if you spend all of your time with other people who play golf, then it begins to look like a culture. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Smokers. Yeah, no kidding, because they're always spending all that time together outside now. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it really does. It didn't used to be as strongly as it is now, but now I'd say it really is beginning to be a kind of a culture, smokers' culture. Yeah. He said rural, urban, and suburban. Absolutely right. That people spend time, again, in rural situations, they spend more time in that situation than in the urban one. Generates this kind of culture. Anything else? Yeah.
Among students in the school, it's fashion cause, like fashion differences in fashion cause they have in school.
So. And I think that this is the basis of a lot of these kind of cliques. And the clique may be around fashion, it may be around some other issue, but insofar as you maintain all of your time with other people who share your fashion sense, then you could talk about a kind of fashion culture, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or single parents sometimes can be seen as a kind of a cultural group, or couples with children. What do you know? They spend more time with other couples with children rather than, yeah. Did I just steal the one of whoever raised your hand? Single married, yeah. So you see the idea. It does not apply to families, because we call those family systems, and it doesn't apply to individuals. We call that personality. But when we look at groups of people interacting, maintaining this, that's where we get these patterns. Okay, now, when we talk about these groups, which I'm going to do, I'm going to spend the rest of the time giving you examples of cultural differences that are related to these different kinds of groups here, okay? That's what the whole rest of the session is going to be about. But some of you are going to say, wait a minute. He just said something about women, and I'm a woman, and that's not true for me. Or he said something about European Americans, and I'm one, and I don't think that's true. He's just stereotyping, And this is a real difficult problem. How are we able to talk about cultural differences and make appropriate generalizations without stereotyping people? That's the question. And the way that we do it is like this. We say, okay, let's assume that the difference exists on this kind of a continuum here. And on one end of the continuum, we put a value. One way to do this, anyway, is to put a value like individualism. Individualism is that great, tends to be an American, tends to be European American value of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be self-reliant, Blessed be the child that makes it on his own. Those kinds of statements are associated with this kind of individualism. As opposed to a more group or what's called collectivist orientation, which people say things like the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Who you are is a function of the group that you belong to. And this stands in quite a bit of contrast to one another. These people say it's okay to be an individual, but not at the expense of the group. Otherwise, you're being selfish and egocentric. And these people say, well, it's okay to join a group, but not at the expense of your individuality. Otherwise, it's a cult. See? There's quite a bit of tension here. Now, we can say that U.S. Americans in general, let's say, are more individualistic compared to Japanese people who are more group-oriented. But here's how we can say that without stereotyping either group. We can say, if you do research on the entirety of the American population, you see something like this. You see a skewed curve where the central tendency of the population falls over here somewhere on this individualistic side. You see that more people are over here than over here. And that if you compare that to a Japanese population, you find that the Japanese people, the central tendency of that group is over on this side of the continuum. More people are over here than over there. That's the cultural generalization, you see. It becomes a statement of probability when it's applied to individuals. That is, a given U.S. individual is more likely to be in this group than this group. A given Japanese person is more likely to be in this group than this group, but it's not an absolute statement. And of course, not everybody in the culture is individualistic. Are all U.S. people individualistic? Oh, you can see it down here. There's a whole bunch of them down here in the tail who are group-oriented, some of whom are every bit as group-oriented as any Japanese person. And are all Japanese people group-oriented? No. There's some Japanese people who are individualistic, some of whom are every bit as individualistic as any U.S. American. It's just that these people here are deviants. Deviants. Which is a very good sociological term, which means more than 2 standard deviations from the norm. It just means they're out there in the tails, not in the mainstream in regards to something, you see. So I'm in the position of making a generalization. May I assume that you are a U.S. American, sir? Okay. The generalization is, it is more likely than not that you are individualistic rather than group-oriented, or that you're more individualistic than group-oriented. This is a working hypothesis, but I don't know for sure. The moment I say, because you're a U.S. American, therefore you are individualistic, then I'm stereotyping you. I'm applying the generalization to every single case. Because who knows? He could be a deviant. We need to check around. I need to talk to him and find out. And I might be surprised. He might be one of those Americans, and there are quite a few of them here, who is in fact pretty group-oriented, see? So it's a hypothesis that we're generating here, not any kind of absolute statement. That's the way a generalization is appropriately used. The other way that we can get a stereotype is by generalizing from too small a sample. That means you met one of them one time. Oh yeah, I met this Mexican guy. Now we know how they are, you see. And this is particularly dangerous because the first people that you meet from another group are likely to be deviant. Why is that the case, do you think? Yeah, because you met them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's right. The people who are seeking out contact with folks outside of their group tend not to be from the mainstream of their group. Sometimes they are, but they tend not to be a little bit. So, for instance, the first people of color who decide they're going to go into largely white-dominated organizations tend not to be representative of their groups, okay? Or the first women who decide to go into, predominantly male occupations tend not to be representative of female gender culture. They tend to be either deviant or bicultural. And it's also dangerous to try to generalize from the behavior of a bicultural person, because you look at them and the person looks like they're acting just like you. And you go, oh, well, that must be the way that culture is. It's hardly any different from my culture. But in fact, what you're seeing is the person's ability to behave in your cultural terms. That's what bicultural means. See? So any number of people of color come to me and say, hey, we know how to do white. You got to know how to do white, to get along, in this kind of organization. Or women who come to me and say, hey, we know how to do male. I just watched you doing it at lunch. It was really good, just flip right into that, and do it, and then also be able to flip back out of it, you see. And this is bicultural. And most women And most people of color, I say, are more likely to be bicultural than dominant culture folks, that is, white males, because white males don't need to be, haven't needed to be up until recently. This is now changing. It's now everybody's business to be bicultural, not just those other people. We're all ethnic. We all need to become bi-ethnic. All right. So, without stereotyping, I'm going to give you a few examples of how these cultural differences operate. I'll give you some examples of language, a few examples of nonverbal behavior, then we'll take a break, then we'll come back and talk about, just helping you pace yourself, and then we'll come back and talk about some differences in communication style. I believe you have a page, don't you, called Checklist for Intercultural Communication. This check, is it in there? Oh, good, yeah. This gives the typical categories for looking at cultural difference. Language use, style, as you can see, nonverbal behavior, value differences. I'll give you examples of all of these things. First of all, let's talk about language. Language is a funny thing in this society. Do you know that the U.S. society is probably one of the few, well, is one of the very few monolingual societies in the world? This is one of the only places in the world where it's considered to be okay to only speak one language, and in fact even preferable sometimes to speak only one language. Just ask these refugees who come in to the country and people say, stop speaking your language and speak English. We even have laws, English only, and things like that, to try to get people to only speak English, until of course they get to college or high school, and then we say, learn a foreign language. We do not have a very consistent attitude about language. I would say one thing that's likely to happen is that more of us are going to become bilingual as we begin moving into this kind of a multicultural society. And beyond just being bilingual, more of us are going to become bicultural, as I already mentioned. In the meantime, I think what's happening is a lot of us are going to be experiencing folks who speak English with an accent. And of course, an accent is anybody who doesn't speak English the way you speak it. They have an accent, and whoever we are, don't, of course. But in any case, you hear English being spoken as a second language, as a foreign language sometimes, and you hear an accent. Now, we have a strange thing that we do. First of all, when we hear an accent, we have a tendency to stop listening, panic, and send the person off to somebody who specializes in accents. This is our first tendency. And then if we are not able to do that, if we actually have to listen to that person, then we do an interesting thing with our voices. Do you know what it is? Yeah, we talk louder. We start going, hello! How are you? It's very strange why we do that. It's a person who's just speaking with an accent, and we're yelling at him. Folks, I've heard that this is also true for people with various kinds of physical disabilities. I don't know about mental disabilities, but folks in wheelchairs, for instance, will report to me that people yell at them. They say, why are they yelling? We're just sitting here, and people are going, oh, like we can't hear. Or blind people for whom this is particularly obnoxious, to speak loudly because they're depending on their hearing, or deaf people. I mean, why do we yell at deaf people? Deaf. So it appears as if raising our voices is the generic solution to the problem of obstacles to communication. You see, if you think that there's going to be some problem communicating, if you just say it louder, it's going to break through that barrier and the meaning will explode in the other person's head. That's sort of naive view of communication, but nevertheless, I think, we unconsciously tend to do that. And if the person that we're speaking with not only speaks with an accent, but also speaks haltingly with a limited vocabulary, we then shift into not only a loud but patronizing tone of voice. Hello, how are we today, we say to these people, as if we are speaking to a child. See, and here's where that comes from, that unconsciously the only model that we have for people who do not speak language fluently in our own society is what? Children. And so when we hear somebody speaking our language without the same kind of adult fluency that we're used to, we automatically, unconsciously, at a gut level, shift into treating them as if they're a child. Now, this is very obnoxious, of course, so the person who's being treated that way frequently recognizes this kind of patronizing tone, and we should probably control for doing that. A good way to catch yourself on that is to remember who it is that knows 2 languages here. Right. And that keeps you from kind of shifting too much into that kind of patronizing thing. And again, this is not because you intend to be patronizing. This is an unconscious tendency which comes because you're looking for some kind of a model for how to treat that person, and you search your own cultural banks to try to find that model. Let me say in passing that common sense is not a good thing cross-culturally. People say, well, just use common sense. Well, common sense is common only to your own culture. And common sense, it draws on a kind of gut feeling. And unless you are a bicultural person, your gut is not a good base for determining appropriate behavior cross-culturally, because you don't have a gut feeling for the other culture. So you're operating from your own gut feeling, or what we sometimes call common sense, and it mostly doesn't work. So a lot of this is getting stuff out of our guts and into our heads, at least initially. You know, that's what a lot of it is. Another thing that we have a tendency to do is we have a tendency to think that people's tone of voice, or our own tone of voice, is going to be easily understood by others. So, for instance, if I say, I'm going to stop picking on you. I say to this fellow over here, nice shirt. See, he knows to not take that real seriously, probably. Or if I say to you, get out of here. You know, you're not likely to, unless you're looking for an excuse to leave, you know, you're not likely to jump up and leave, because you recognize the difference between my saying, get out of here, and saying, get out of here, right? When we go, with my voice, it means don't take this seriously. You know, that's what it means. Everybody knows that, right? Only members of a language community know that. In this case, the community of English speakers, and in this case, probably the community of American English speakers know that when I say, get out of here, that it doesn't mean that you should leave. I'm kidding, you see? Now, people who do not speak English as their first language don't hear that frequently. What they hear is, get out of here. They don't hear the nuance. And so we must be careful about thinking that we are communicating humor, sarcasm, or kidding to somebody with our tone of voice if that person is not a native speaker of our own brand of English. The reverse side of that is that when we believe that other people's tones of voice mean what they would mean in our own culture, in our own language community. So, for instance, well, I got to tell you something about how English is spoken, and then I'll give you a contrast. In American English, we have something which is called a pitch drop at the end of a sentence. So you speak a sentence, you go, this is a sentence. Go up on the next to the last syllable and down on the last syllable like that. See? This is a sentence. He fell off the precipice. And next to the last stressed syllable, and then you drop your voice down. Let's go get a hamburger. See, you go up and then you fall off like that. Everybody does that except for some reason preachers, who have a tendency to lilt at the end of sentences, like that, you know. Yeah. No, you can tell. You can, if you tune the radio, you know, and when you hit the religious station, you can hear the change in the intonation pattern, you know. And the other people who do this, of course, are valley girls. May not be a popular category. Do y'all know about valley girls out here in Michigan? Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, for some reason, valley girls and preachers, you know, all share this pattern, but most, and I know, and yeah. Strange bedfellows. Well, this is the more typical pattern over here, though. Now, how quickly your voice falls off is meaningful. And this is a normal. So if you have a normal pitch drop, you expect normal things to happen. Say you go into somebody's office, and the person says, come in, sit down. What can I do for you? Normal pitch drop, you expect normal interaction, you go and do your business. If they give you, however, an abrupt pitch drop, that means they drop their voice off quickly, it may mean something different. Come in, sit down. What can I do for you? You go, hey, never mind. Come back later. They're communicating something to you, aren't they? They're saying, I don't like you, I'm busy, something like that. It's the opposite of the elongated pitch drop, which frequently conveys friendliness. Come in, sit down. What can I do for you? You go, all right, you know, that kind of place, you know. That's like a used car salesman or something, maybe not, you know, but Not to stereotype used car salesmen. There's another pattern here you want to watch out for, which is the one that goes down and then up. This might mean something else again. Come in. Sit down. What can I do for you? So you don't want to go in there either, probably. You know. Sometimes in Oregon we call that the Packwood tone. Yeah. So anyway, isn't it interesting, you know, that we all instantly recognize, don't we? We all instantly recognize the meaning that goes along with something so subtle as how quickly we drop our voices off at the end of sentences. Now, when people learn English as a second language, they frequently do not learn this pattern. For instance, speakers of Chinese, or Cantonese particularly, form of Chinese, have pitch changes in words, but not over whole sentences, and they tend not to learn this. Chinese is spoken, it sounds to American English ears kind of staccato, da 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 da, and a little louder too, da 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 da. Sometimes English speakers think Chinese speakers are having arguments all the time. Because if English were spoken that way, we'd be arguing. But Chinese people just talking about the weather, you know, what they're going to do that afternoon. When a Chinese person has learned English as a second language without this pattern, sometimes you can get funny things. You go into say a Chinese restaurant where the maitre d' is Chinese and speaking English as a second language, and there's no table available. He's going to tell you to wait. So he says to you, "You go sit down over there." See, a little louder, no pitch drop on the end, right? Now, how often do we look at this person and go, "Isn't cultural diversity wonderful?" You know? See, we're back to like those primates around the fire, aren't we? We're saying, "What's the matter with this person? Why is he being rude to me?" And of course, person, you know, when you think about it, this does not bear close scrutiny. That the person is not trying to make you angry. The person values your business, undoubtedly. And the person is just simply speaking to you in English with a Chinese pitch pattern. That's what's going on, you see? It's a simple thing. We need to get our responses out of our gut and into our heads to recognize these kinds of things. There's, you know, small little things, but things that are certainly important. And some other things with voices, I think, are important. One big issue in some big cities between African Americans and European Americans has to do with the perception of intensity, particularly around the use of one's voice. I'll quote you some research that was done by a friend of mine, Thomas Kochman, and it's reported in his book, Black and White Styles in Conflict, where he noted that young kids, these are little black kids and white kids on the schoolyards, having fights, that it was frequently the white kid who threw the first punch. He thought was kind of interesting, so he went out to interview these kids, and he said to the white kid, why'd you haul off and hit this other kid? He said, he was about to hit me, so I hit him first. So he went to the other kid and said, why do you think this kid hit you? He said, I don't know, we're just talking, and he hauled off and hit me. Kochman got interested in this, so he decided to go off and interview older European American and African American males to find out what cues they looked for to tell if the other person was about to become violent. Fighting cues, they're called. Now, for those of you in the audience who are not male, you should be aware that males spend a considerable amount of time assessing whether other males are going to become violent or not. We do. It's not just like a general safety thing. It's like walking down the street. We mentally rehearse, what would I do if that person hit me? Yeah, and so you're walking down and you go, hey, 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 yeah, like that, you know, and you have these moves all kind of set up, you know. And I mean, and of course, people generally don't just haul off and hit you, but actually there are these rehearsals that go on. Not all males, of course, but it appears to be more frequent for males to do this than females. My wife says it's because of our reptilian brains, you know, and testosterone poisoning or something, you know, but anyway. Anyway, it turns out that both black males and white males indeed have a very elaborate set of cues that they look for in another male to tell when they're about to become violent. This is a well-developed perceptual skill. It's just that it's different between the African Americans and the European Americans. The European Americans are looking for what we can call intensity. And now let me describe what intensity means. Intensity means that your voice begins to rasp like this, your face contorts a little bit like this, and you start using intense vocabulary. These are generally words with mother in them. And for the white guys, this is the sign that violence is imminent. And so you need to take action. You either need to hit that person first or get out of there or whatever, some fight or flight response. Now he asked the African American guys, they also had ways of telling whether the other person was going to become violent, but they didn't have anything to do with intensity. They said, you know, a little rasp, you know, a few words with mother in them, we're just talking. What's really dangerous is when the other person stops talking and changes position. Then you want to watch out. Now the white guy said, hey, the best thing can happen is the other guy stops talking and changes position. Then, you know, that means it's over. Boom, and then he gets hit, right? And for the black guy, you know, he's going, you know, hey, we're just talking here, you know, and boom, he's getting it too. And this can be very serious, particularly when the people making these judgments are police officers. You know, and this is occurring between police officers and citizens in highly charged situations. People get killed over this issue. You know, I'm convinced. You know, I've seen this happen even in Portland, Oregon, and I know it must happen in other places where there's more interracial, or in this case, cross-cultural contact between police and citizens. We need to understand little things like that. Another form of nonverbal behavior is gesturing. You ever seen an Italian movie that's been dubbed into English? So you got Italian actors, but English is coming out of their mouths. So you see things like, well, I don't really know about that, you know. It's kind of, you know, big, you know, Mediterranean gesturing, you know, but it's wrong, you know. I mean, you can tell, it looks funny. The reason is because English is generally spoken with a middle range of gesturing. You know, well, I don't really know about, well, you know, it's not like that, but, you know, I don't really know about that. We tend to keep our upper arms fairly close down to our sides. We don't get it way out there, you know, in our gesturing. And in fact, you can put this gesturing on a kind of continuum, where the European Americans tend to be sort of more or less in the middle of this. I mean, I'm not being Eurocentric here, you know, it's just that we can actually distribute on either side of these European Americans. So this middle gesture is like this. And as you move up the continuum into broader gesturing, you get into, in the U.S., Hispanic or Latina groups. African Americans tend to be a little bit broader in their gesturing generally. You get out a little bit further and you get into some of the Arab groups, Middle Eastern groups, including Middle Eastern Jewish, as well as Middle Eastern Arab groups and Persians, who tend to be a little broader out here. And then finally you get way down here to those Greeks and those Italians, you know, they're way out there. Now on the other side of these European Americans are some of the Northern Europeans, you know, Germans and French, Germans anyway, who tend to be a little more restrained in their gesturing. Some of the Scandinavian folks, if you watch the Olympics, you could see some of those Norwegians go for long periods of time without moving anything, you know, and just talk to you like this. Yeah. And further on down here, you'd see you'll see Asian cultures, Japanese. Actually, it goes Chinese, Korean. Japanese is pretty far down here, and then most Native Americans, American Indian groups, tend to be very, very restrained in public, like this. See, it's kind of like a little sort of ethnography of gesturing. Now, what's interesting is when these people come into contact. So let's say you have one of these people here coming in contact with one of these people here. Yeah, they're coming together and so for some reason. What's going to happen? Are they going to look at each other and say, isn't cultural diversity wonderful? No. You know, they say, what's the matter with that person? This person here, what's he going to say that's wrong with this person over here? Cold fish? Not listening? Pardon me? Behavior, we then may make the assumption that they lack self-esteem or have poor leadership potential or, you know, things like that. What's this person here thinking about this person here? Whoa, crazy, yeah, unpredictable. Oh, there they come again. Wow, you know. Remember, this person here has been taught by his or her mother and father, when you're in public, express yourself. Show what a unique individual you are. Whereas this person here has been taught by his mother or father, when you're in public, never cause anyone to lose face. Be predictable, and that way people will not be surprised by your actions and they won't lose face. So these people have gotten really quite different kinds of cultural conditioning. Neither one of those is particularly good or bad. It's just that the problems occur when they come into contact with one another, you see. And this can be quite a serious and difficult matter. Eye contact is another aspect of this nonverbal behavior. People supposed to look at you when they talk? I mean, we unconsciously, U.S. Americans spend a lot of time relying on eye contact to make judgments about things like self-esteem, honesty, other kinds of things. And because we're looking for this pattern here. We're looking for the person who matches my talking to you. When I talk, I look at you about 50% of the time. And then I look away like this, and I look back, talk, talk, talk. You look at me about 80% of the time. There are studies. People study this. You look at me about 80% of the time. Once in a while you look away, but you try to look away when I'm looking away, so that when I look back, you're still looking at me. See, that's the rule. Okay? If I pause, I look away like this. I don't say anything, so you don't say anything. And then then it's your turn. I look back and I lock eyes. Stop talking. Can you feel it? You've been given a turn. You're supposed to say something, even if you don't have anything to say. Used to be back in the old days we could say far out. I don't think people say that anymore, though, right? Yeah. See, now this pattern is very, very cultural. It turns out that in Northern European countries, particularly German, but also British and French countries to some extent, people make eye contact much more directly. So let me use somebody. Let me use you right there. Yeah. People make eye contact. Yellow sweater. Directly like this. And they go talk, 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 talk. After about 15 seconds, I should have looked away, but I haven't. And so pretty quick, you start going, whoa. I mean, we don't even know each other, right? And this is coming on kind of strong here. And this level of eye contact tends to be perceived by U.S. Americans as being either sexually or physically aggressive, when in fact for most Northern Europeans it's the normal way that you make contact. And by the way, when it's your turn, I turn away and stop talking. You think I'm pausing, so you don't say anything, you see. And so Europeans say about the U.S., they say, Americans are always interrupting you. And when it is their turn, they don't have anything to say. That's it. Yeah. And part of that is because we're screwed up on the turn-taking. Another whole pattern of turn-taking that tends to be more Middle Eastern and also African-American to a greater degree, remember generalizations, not stereotypes, is the relay race pattern, where one person is talking along and the other person comes right in on top and they talk together like this. Talk, 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 talk. And it is kind of like you hand the baton off to the other person, who then carries on the conversation. Talk, 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 until the other person has something to say, and then he or she comes in and they go talk, 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 talk for a while, and then that person carries the baton off, you see. So this is kind of little relay race shifts in turn taking. Isn't that interesting? Now, what do you think the turn takers think about that pattern? It's rude, right? People are interrupting one another. What do you suppose these people here think about the turn takers? They don't care. They don't have any passion. They don't have any, I mean, if they cared, they'd jump right in and say something. But instead, here they are just waiting, for a turn. So we need to understand these to engage in these cross-cultural dialogues. Many Asians don't use either of those patterns. What do? They wait for silence. They wait for a silence to occur. And if there's a long enough silence, then they think, oh, well, everybody's finished saying what they have to say. Now I can say what I want to say. See? When's the last time you were in a group with a big, long period of silence? So a lot of Asian and as well as Native American participants never get a chance to talk. We actually train them how to get a turn in a group. We train Japanese students on how to get a turn in a U.S. American group. We say what you do is you try to catch the eye of the person who's talking, and you lean forward slightly, make a little motion, and make a little sound. Eh! And that way you indicate to the speaker that you would like the speaker to end with her eyes on you, in which case you've been signaled to turn, But actually there are many people in the world who have no idea how to do that. But, and you all know how to do it, most of you, but you know how to do it naturally. You don't know that you know how to do that. It's not a pattern. Isn't that interesting? Or how close do you stand to people? That's another whole thing, The U.S. distance is, you're supposed to be about this far away, right here. And when people get closer, like this, we have a tendency to sort of back up like this, or to protect ourselves like this, or do something like that, that because that person too close, in this personal space. I know most of you know about this. And so when you're in elevators, for instance, people don't make eye contact with one another because they're too close with one another, too close. So everybody looks at the numbers. And then sometimes what happens is this person comes up here like this, and unconsciously our gut says, too close, so we back up to where it's right for us. And then that person says, unconsciously, his gut says, too far, and so he comes up like this, see? And you can actually see this happen. You can watch people go down halls where it's an Arab person or a Latino person who's trying to deal with an Anglo person where you're supposed to have a little more distance, or an Asian person where you're supposed to have a little more distance. And these people will do this whole dance all the way down the hall. And then you get into touch cultures. Cultures where you can't talk to somebody without being in physical contact with them. This is true for a lot of Latino groups, males and females as well. You know, you've got to be in physical contact. Also, I have a very good Persian friend from Iran who it comes from one of these touch cultures, and so and it's also a real close culture. So when I come up to see him, he comes right up here, right? And so I have to kind of stand my ground because he's inside my focus. Okay, so he's right up here, and then he inevitably reaches out and straightens my tie and picks little pieces of lint off my coat. And it's the nicest thing. I explained this to I mentioned this to some other Persian guy. He said, "Oh, he must really like you." That is the thing that friends do with other friends, is that they engage in that kind of, tactile, almost grooming behavior. See? Now in the U.S., same-sex touching tends to be associated with homosexuality. In the U.S., and you should realize that, never mind whether you think that's good or bad, it is a misinterpretation of the behavior of most other people in the world who see same-sex touching as being a sign of friendship. You know, that males walk around hand in hand, arm in arm. This is appropriate friendship behavior and doesn't mean anything more than that. So anyway, that gets us started thinking a little bit about some of these cultural differences. Time for a break, and we'll come back and hit some of these very interesting differences in communication style. 15 minutes, please. That means we'll start at 25 till. You have, I think, gotten the idea that I'm suggesting that we all need to become kind of amateur anthropologists. At least to a certain degree, we need to be aware of not only our own culture, we call that cultural self-awareness, but also to be aware of other cultural patterns. Now, we're not going to become experts on every culture that we deal with, but we need to have these sort of general categories for looking at cultural differences. And you can use any situation to study this kind of culture. I'll give you an example of recently I was in a tire store getting tires put on my car. And Chris, the owner of the store, was introducing Joe from next door to Pete, who was putting tires on the car. And he said, "Pete, this here is Joe from next door." And Joe said, "You trying to insult me or something?" And I thought, well, gee, it didn't sound insulting to me, so I started listening more carefully. And Chris, without missing a beat, he seemed to know what was wrong here, said, "Oh yeah," he says, "Pete, this here son of a bitch, Joe, from next door, who's got nothing better to do than sit on his ass all day, is coming over here to bother us again." And Joe says, "Thanks, that's better." And I went, whoa, man, this is pretty interesting kind of anthropology here. What a strange thing that these people just did, until I realized it was a pattern, a cultural pattern, with which I was familiar, and it was the male insult greeting. Yeah. So see, now you know what I'm talking about. This is what it is that leads males, largely white males, although you see it also amongst Latino and African American males, to say to one another, "Who lowered the standards enough to let you in here?" Or "You did the same tie you had on yesterday. What's the matter? You can't afford another tie. Got a minute? Tell me everything you know." These are the kinds of things that males have a tendency to say to one another as part of their kind of making the world safe for each other, and you're supposed to come back with a clever retort, and then everybody knows that it's okay to continue the conversation. It's kind of a greeting. Nothing wrong with this. It's just a sort of male behavior. The only problem comes when it's used cross-culturally, like, say, for instance, with women. And And then it turns out that by and large, women do not have this pattern. Now, bicultural women actually can be very good at doing this, frighteningly good. But, but the natural female pattern is not to use an insult as part of greeting. What is it? What is the natural female greeting pattern? A compliment. You look nice. I really like those earrings. God, I really like the way you fix that hair. That color looks so good. And males, when they hear this, they think it's insincere. They think that women go, nice earrings, bitch. When they, that's what they're thinking. I'm sorry to tell you that. But females, my informants tell me that this is generally not the case. That generally women look for something that you really can sincerely compliment about the other person. And if you think the person's hair looks bad, you generally don't say, I think it looks good. You find something else that you can compliment, you see. And again, nothing bad or good about it. It's just that this is more of a female pattern than it is a male pattern. Now, and the problems come when these things come into contact with one another. So when the male uses the insult greeting with a female, God, you look awful today, right? See, rather than you coming back with some clever retort, instead you might go, oh, God, I really do, and go off and do something, because you would see that take that more seriously than it might be intended by a male. On the other hand, males, when they are, first of all, males do not compliment one another. If they do, it's seen as rather strange. If I say to you, God, nice tie. See, he's waiting for the other shoe to drop. So too bad you spilled your lunch on it, or something like that. That turns it into a male greeting. So males are not used to this compliment. So when they hear a compliment coming from a woman, first of all, they're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then when it doesn't drop, then they put it into the only context which they know for complimenting, which is a courtship context, or as we say in shorthand, sex. And so when the male hears the compliment and she says, oh, I really like your tie, I may go, waiting for the other shoe to drop, doesn't, and then I go, oh, so would you like to talk about it over dinner tonight, you see, where I put this into a sexual, and again, this is all kind of unconscious, and we need to probably work out the content of our greetings. What do we talk about? Do we talk about insults? Do we talk about compliments? Can we talk about our family or not talk about our family? Another issue here is privacy. What constitutes private as opposed to public information? There was in the West Coast, an African-American woman in an organization said to me that every Monday morning she had this little kind of cross-cultural experience where she was working with other European-American women, and said that every Monday morning they'd ask her, what'd you do over the weekend? And she said, well, it's a pretty typical question amongst, white women or white folks in general. And she said she felt like her natural cultural response would be to say back to them, none of your business. Unless I am a good friend of yours, I'm not going to tell you what I did over the weekend, because what I did over the weekend is my private business. This is more of a public situation. I'll talk to you about public stuff, but not about private stuff. She said, but I knew what they'd think if I did that. Which is what? That she was stuck up or unfriendly or, too good to tell us about what she did over the weekend. So this woman said, well, she always made up something to tell them, So it didn't seem like she was stuck up, But so there's a cultural difference in this particular woman's case, anyway, on what she considered private and what she considered public. This is, by the way, a difference that cuts across some other categories, like the nonverbal behavior. If you're European American, you're supposed to leak emotion a little bit. It's like you're supposed to leak your private life into your public life. So you're supposed to tell a little bit about what you did in your private life, but not too much, and that shows you're friendly. You're also, when you walk around, you're supposed to leak emotion out of your face. Let me demonstrate. Like that. So I'm just exaggerating a little bit, see? But you're supposed to show some emotions. You're not supposed to walk around in public when other people can see you looking like this. See, if you walk down the hall looking like that, what are people going to think? So you're hostile. You're angry about something. And yet there are entire whole cultures, which, by the way, include many Asian cultures and African Americans in general, who do not believe that it's appropriate to leak emotion when you're just walking around, that emotion should be directed at the person. So I'll walk around like this until somebody talks to me and they go, oh, yeah, see, and then I'll express emotion, but I'll direct it towards you, and when I'm finished talking to you, I'll shift back to street face, you see. And this can be misinterpreted by people who come from cultures where you're constantly supposed to be leaking a little bit of emotion out of your face, just when you're walking around. So anyway, a little interesting thing. All right, and the other thing is, how long do this greeting go on? Is it 30 seconds? Hi, how are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. What'd you do over the weekend? Well, da-da-da-da. Well, listen, the reason I came to talk to you is, or is this one of these things that goes on for a little bit longer, maybe a few minutes, who knows, maybe even an hour. In some cultures, maybe even days, that one is engaged in largely greeting rituals with one another. This is an important area, and it's something that allows us to just get started in the conversation, and we frequently can go wrong just before we even get started. And again, it's not like if you make a mistake here, any horrible thing is going to happen. It's just that by knowing these things, you can avoid some obvious issues, some obvious problems. And when you see stuff coming at you, rather than going, what's the matter with this person, you can instead say, maybe there's a cultural difference operating here. And you have a few categories for looking at these cultural differences. And that's the reason for doing this, not to make us all uptight about our behavior and thinking that, we better watch out, we're going to make a mistake here, but just to be more generally aware of how these things operate cross-culturally. Okay, here's another pattern. This is the European American pattern again. Tends to be the pattern of talking in a straight line. Us European Americans, particularly us males, really like to talk in a nice straight line where A, B, C, point, boom, like that, see? And you're supposed to state the point explicitly. So if you wander off of this line like this, somebody's likely to say to you, I'm not quite following you. Or I followed A and B, but I didn't quite see how C followed. Or I heard you all the way to the end, but I didn't quite hear the point you were making. And there's a little edge to it, like you'd be a better person, if you did that. Or we'll say things like, could you cut to the chase? Could we get to where the rubber meets the road? What's the bottom line? These are all statements really of preference for this linear style of communication. Linear because it's going in a straight line. And of course, most of us have been taught in school that this is indicative of good critical thinking. And so if we want to judge whether somebody's engaging in clear thinking, we judge whether they're on that line or not. And if we're teachers, as many of us are, and the student falls off that line, we get to write on their papers, vague. Which is a way of teaching them that they should stay between the lines, right? On this line here. And in fact, a lot of people in the world don't talk this way. I was in a group one time with some American students who had learned to talk this way, and a Nigerian fellow, and this is not just Nigerian, but I'll use him as an example. And the question was something about early dating practices, and the Americans were going boom, 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 point, boom, 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 point, just like they've been taught. We got to this Nigerian fellow. He said, well, when I was 10 years old, I was walking down the path of my village, and then I came to this tree. He described the tree. And then this storyteller came, and he started telling us the story that the storyteller told under the tree at the end of the path in the village when he was 10 years old. It was like 15 minutes down now, right? And the Americans were going, like this. They were, getting impatient. So we stopped, and we said, well, let's stop here. What's going on? What are you doing? He said, well, I'm answering the question. We said to the Americans, do you think he's answering the question? They go, no, we think he's bullshitting. So we go back over and we said, could you tell us how you're answering the question? And he said, yes. What I'm doing is I am telling you everything you need to know to understand the point. So he was on a different line, all right. He was on a line. It was just a different one. Here, it was this one here. So here's the point in here, and here was A and B and C and D and E. He was telling us a lot more stuff than this one up here, and it was kind of circling in. In this style we call a contextual style, or a circular style, because the purpose of it is to establish context. So we said, fine, if we're just patient, then you'll tell us the point. And he said, oh no. No, he said, once I tell you everything you need to know to understand the point, you'll just know what the point is. I don't have to actually tell you the point. In other words, he leaves the point implicit. Of course, the Americans are going, ah! They're all upset. Because they figure, that you could tell what they were thinking. They were thinking, well, we'll just wait till he comes to the end of this circular thing, and then we'll sort of tune back in when he comes to the point, But then he's saying, he's not going to come to the point, We said, does that mean in your culture nobody tells anybody the point ever? And he said, well, that's not exactly true. He says, you've got to tell little kids the point. Because they're not sophisticated enough to use this adult style of communication here. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. It's kind of a reversal where we think that children talk like this and we need to teach them to talk like this. In his culture, he sees children as talking like this and you need to teach them to talk like this. This is the adult style of communication here. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. When these people meet each other, they have a tendency to have problems. They don't say, isn't diversity wonderful? They say, what's the matter with this other person? If you're one of these linear people, what do you think is wrong with these circular people down here? Pardon me? They're far out. Yeah, you like that, didn't you, huh? Yeah. Too bad you're so young, You missed being able to really say that. All right. Yeah. What's the matter with these people down here? They're nonlinear. Yeah, no kidding, Okay. We may see these people as being evasive. That is, that they're trying to talk around the point. We may see these people as wasting time. We may see these people as having fuzzy thinking or being illogical. And of course, there's always the possibility that they're just stupid. Now, to reverse this, these circular people also tend to evaluate these people up here. And you can imagine what it is. They see these people as being rude, as being abrupt, and as being arrogant. This is an interesting one, because these people up here are deciding what it is that you need to hear, and then they're telling you the point that you should draw from that. See, there's a kind of an arrogance to these people down here who say, well, here's everything I know about this, draw your own conclusion from it, you see, which is then, as you can tell, these people would see that as the more modest position and see this as being arrogant. But then sometimes these people think these people up here are just stupid, too. Okay. Then we call this a mutual negative evaluation. And it's very typical in cross-cultural encounters for people to evaluate each other negatively, frequently in the same way. They each think the other one is stupid. Because, why? They're not sharing this pattern. Now, this pattern actually is the more typical pattern in the world. This is more typical for all Asian cultures, Latin cultures, African cultures, Arab cultures. In the world, in the United States, is more typical for African Americans, Hispanic, Latino, Native Americans heavily, Asian Americans, and amongst all of those groups, including European Americans, it's more typical for women than it is for men. In other words, the only people in the world who naturally use this pattern up here are Northern European and European American males. That's the only natural cultural base for this linear style of communication. But guess who controls the school systems? So we managed to convince everybody that this is the way that you're supposed to talk, when in fact this is actually one of the least common ways of talking in the world. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. What's it good for? It's efficient. Short-term task completion. You bet. This place is on fire. You don't want somebody to be circular about it, Are you feeling warm? I don't know. Let me tell you about a time when I was feeling warm, You don't want that, no. You want, a nice short-term task here, right? Okay. But on the other hand, if your job is to do something that this is good for, which tends to be relationship building, and buy-in and inclusion, that's what this is good for down here. If you're trying to do that and you use this style up here, it tends not to work very well. These are the guys who say, I told you I loved you, let's get on with it. Sort of approaching everything as a short-term task completion. Or, it's the afternoon, we gotta stay awake now, come on. It's good, you can keep listening, these little things are in there. All right. in the, it's like if you have a hammer, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail, right? You know, it's a similar kind of thing. In organizations, you find that people who only know this style and who are given the job of team building, we need to have a team here, tend to approach this by saying, okay, I'm the captain, you're the team, let's go, you know, as if it is a linear short-term task as opposed to a longer-term relationship-building task. And people who use this style have a tendency to know that better. I guess what I'm saying is we should recognize the difference, and best that we could do both. Best that we could do both, right? More often, these people know how to do this than these people know how to do this. So probably those of us who only know this style have a little work to do to learn how to use this style in the appropriate circumstance, at least to recognize that it is an appropriate style. This is a big male-female communication difference as well within the U.S. You know, so men are constantly upset about women, you know, who go on and on and on and on and on talking, you see, and they just can't figure out why they don't just say what, you know, say what's on their mind, you know. And women, on the other hand, you know, get very upset at men because they don't tell them anything, you know, they don't give them enough details to provide the context necessary to understand what's going on. It's like when I talk to my mother on the phone. Sometimes us will go on for some time, and my wife will ask me afterwards, well, how's your mother? And I'll say, she's fine. Cut to the chase, you know. I mean, well, that's the bottom line, you know, she's fine. And the next time, I remember one time we got together, and Mom said, well, I'm so happy that we've cleaned up after the fire. And Janet shot me one of those murderous looks, you know what I mean, you know, and said, what fire? and Mom said, well, you know, the fire in my condo building, you know, but everything's okay now. And Janet turned to me and said, well, you didn't tell me about the fire. I said, well, she's fine, you know, I mean, it's the bottom line, you know, she was okay, you know. So this tends to be a big push, you know, around gender communication. Another difference in the way that people communicate with one another is the extent to which they are direct or indirect. All right. So the direct people have a tendency to come directly to the point and to wait for other people to come directly to the point. Okay, including coming directly to them. So if you have something to say, I expect you to come to me, say it so I can understand it, and say it directly to me. Okay. On the other hand, indirect people, or cultures that are more indirect, which tend to include most Asian and Native American cultures, have a tendency to be waiting for to be observing more subtlety in the communication. One way to describe this is that it's like you have different kinds of radars, like you have different ranges of a radar dish out here, and people from indirect cultures have that range way out there on the horizon. They're looking for things coming up over the horizon. Ooh, look at that. Oh, maybe that means something. You know, kind of looking between the lines. Whereas, you know, the people who are direct, people like me, tend to have the radar turned off. Or at least, you know, down to maybe a foot away, you know, so it's kind of going like this, you know, and, you know, we notice it when it's incoming, you know. Oh, okay, there it is. You know, kind of what you see is what you get. Versus this kind of very, very way out scanning behavior that people who are indirect do. We have a friend who is a Japanese woman who received tenure recently at her university, and she reported that her dean, the dean of her school, dropped by her office and said, "Congratulations on getting tenure." And about a week later, she came to us and said, "What do you think that meant?" And we said, "What?" And she said, "Well, what do you think it meant that he came to my office?" We said, I don't know, maybe he was walking by. And she said, well, why my office and not his office? And she said it was at 5 o'clock. Why do you suppose he waited till the end of the day, you know, rather than doing this earlier in the day? So we said, I don't know, maybe he was, you know, leaving work. And she said, you know, why do you suppose that he waited for a day to tell me this rather than doing, you know? And she went on, and finally we said, look, is this guy a European-American male? She said, yes. We said, all he meant was congratulations, you know. I mean, you know, it's, you know, what you see is what you get, you know. So one of the problems here is that people from indirect cultures overscan. They look for stuff that isn't there. On the other hand, people from direct cultures don't see things that the people from the indirect cultures expect them to see. I was in Malaysia one time We had this wonderful guide. He'd just taken us all over in wonderful places, spoke English extremely well. And he was supposed to pick us up the next day to take us on some trip to the jungle. And so as he dropped us off, he said, well, it's going to rain tomorrow. We said, uh-huh. And he said, well, it's going to rain really hard tomorrow. You're likely to get wet. We said, hey, we're from Oregon. You know, I mean, no problem. We know wet. And he said, it's going to rain really, really hard, and you're going to get really, really wet. And still, we said, oh, boy, well, I guess that's the way it goes. I mean, you know, we got to keep our schedule, and we got to, you know, we'll have to go off on this trip, and, you know, so I guess we'll just have to get wet. And he goes, okay, well, see you tomorrow. Now, any of you who know about indirect cultures, do you think he showed up the next day? No. He's saying, I can't come. Whoa, yeah, right. And he's expecting us to kind of be out there scanning, saying, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean that he's saying it's going to rain tomorrow? Oh, yeah. Maybe that means he can't come. And so then we're supposed to say back, you know, we're supposed to say back, gee, maybe we should wait for the next day, in which case he would go, good idea, because it's really going to be sunny then, you know, or something like that, to indicate that, yes, indeed, that's what he was trying to communicate to us, but he couldn't come right out and say it without him losing face and us losing face. And so this face saving is an important part of the indirect strategy. Or another strategy that indirect cultures use is to use third-person intermediaries. So rather than coming directly to you, I come to... what's your name? Janet. You're Janet. You're Mary. Okay. So I got this thing with Mary. So rather than going directly to Mary, I go to Janet, and I say, Janet, you know, I got this problem with Mary. Now, if you come from a culture that is indirect, you are likely to take this as an assignment of being a third-person intermediary. Not that I'm gossiping, but that I am trying to communicate to Mary, but cannot communicate face-to-face with her. And so you go to Mary and say, hey, Milton's got this problem. And Mary says, well, here's what I think about that. You clean that up. You bring it back to me and say, you know, here's what Mary thinks, and so forth. And meanwhile, Mary and I maintain civil relationships in our face-to-face interaction. Okay? Now, of course, in direct cultures, people think that's what? Hypocritical. You know, that's gossip. That's talking behind people's back. And yet, in more other cultures in the world, I got to tell you this, in almost every other culture in the world, indirectness is considered the appropriate, mature, sophisticated way of communicating, and directness is seen as rather immature. It's the way children talk, you see. And so Americans are frequently judged as being superficial and immature, and part of the reason is because we have this rather unusual style of being direct. Now, again, I'm not telling you that you all have to become indirect in your style. It's just, let's recognize this. When somebody comes to us and says, so-and-so has a problem, rather than immediately saying, so send so-and-so to talk to us, why don't we consider the possibility that this is a third-person intermediary intervention that's occurring here, and listen to what that person has to say, and maybe use them initially anyway as a conduit for the communication. So that's the difference between direct and indirect, which is, I think I mentioned here, subtlety, I guess, or directness. There are a couple of others that I want to mention here to you that I think are interesting styles. One of them is the difference between it being attached and detached. This is not on your sheet, but I was giving you some examples from the category communication style on this thing called Checklist for Intercultural Communication. Now, some things that are not on your sheet that I want to add to that. European Americans tend to be detached, particularly males. We tend to be detached. If you want to talk about something, calm down. See, if you get too emotionally upset, if you get too passionate, if it looks like you're getting too excited, see, we can't talk about it objectively. So you need to calm down. I'll give you time to calm down. Then we can talk about it. See. Now, if you come from cultures that are attached, exactly the opposite is the case. That to talk about something, you need to have some emotion in it. You need to have some passion. You need to have some commitment. And if people get all detached, it looks like they don't care about what they're saying, and you don't bother to talk to them. This is a big difference, as a generalization, not a stereotype, between European American and African American culture. That African Americans, by and large, are more attached, and European Americans, by and large, are more detached. This is also, of course, true with males and females within European American culture, where the males tend to be more detached, females tend to be a little more attached. But if you just take the African American, European American example, you find that African Americans, in discussing important multicultural issues like racism, tend to approach those issues with passion. Why? Because it's culturally appropriate to communicate in an attached, personally involved, personally committed way. Europeans, on the other hand, cannot hear that. That as soon as they see this level of emotional activation, the European Americans shut down. They are unable to operate at a high level of emotional activation. And consequently, the European Americans withdraw from that conversation saying, we can't talk about this, people are too upset. And the African Americans, who are having a perfectly easy time communicating at this somewhat higher affective level, are saying, you just don't want to talk about it, you just can't be confronted, and fail to recognize that the European Americans, while sometimes maybe avoiding the topic, I mean, certainly that's true sometimes, but other times they are culturally unable to participate in that style, or at least they're culturally disinclined to participate in the style. So there needs to be some negotiation of the level of attachment that will be used in discussing issues, given that kind of cultural difference. This is also true between many Asian cultures that tend to be very detached and European cultures that are a bit more attached, relatively speaking. This is related to the next one, which is called intellectual and relational confrontation. There are two forms of confrontation. By confrontation, I mean, this is not on your list again. I'm adding this. There are two forms of confrontation. One of them is the confrontation that Americans are used to, which is what's called a relational confrontation. And that is my saying, we need to talk. We've got a problem here. We need to talk about our relationship. We even go to classes to learn how to say, when you, I feel. These kind of assertiveness things that are really classes in how to become how to confront one another positively, but nevertheless to confront one another in a positive way relationally. The Americans, on the other hand, are not very good at intellectual confrontation. We tend to say when we disagree with somebody, maybe there's another way of thinking about that. I believe that there might be another perspective on that. We're taught to use this somewhat circuitous way of addressing intellectual disagreement. This is quite the opposite of most European cultures, particularly Germans and other Northern Europeans, who have a tendency to be intellectually confronted but not relationally confronted. So most Europeans are willing to say to you, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But they do not mean that you should take that personally, because, personally, in fact, they might be even uncomfortable about talking about the nature of the relationship. But in any case, thinking that your idea is stupid is not something that you should take personally. Americans, on the other hand, think that the intellectual confrontation is just a form of the relational confrontation, and so they take it seriously, and we get it all messed up. As I was in, I'll give you an example. I was in Britain recently, just got back actually last week from London, and I was having dinner with this guy who was looking at a proposal that I'd written, and we just had this great dinner, I mean, it was just so nice, and wine and everything. It was just really, really comfy, and I like this guy, I still do. I like this guy. And, well, wait till I tell you what happened, right? And he, so after the dinner, he said, well, perhaps we should talk about this proposal that you submitted. I said, fine. He said, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen in my life. He said, I cannot believe that you have hackneyed the English language to this extent. It's filled with jargon and, ridiculous, superficial ideas. And in fact, the whole thing was so absurd that I took it home to my partner, and the two of us had a big laugh over it. Really, and I'm practically throwing up now. And then I want to share with you that when you feel your stomach doing that, it's a good sign that maybe something cultural is going on, right? So I thought, so I started searching the database to see what, oh yeah, that's right, this relational intellectual confrontation, and I realized that he was intellectually confronting me, but not necessarily relationally being confronted. So I said, well, okay. I said, I'm going to do something back to you that's, first of all, is kind of American, and then maybe something that's more British. He was already kind of puzzled, because Europeans don't talk about their communication patterns that much. And so I said, okay, here's the American thing. I hope what I'm about to say doesn't hurt your feelings. See, the relational. I'm concerned with the relationship dimension. I said, okay, here comes the European thing, or the British thing. You don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. You're totally ignorant in the area of social science, and I resent the fact that you are presuming to comment on something that you have absolutely no knowledge base for commenting. He said, oh yes, well I suppose you're right about that, you know. Yes. And that was it, yeah. In other words, it was appropriate to confront him back at the intellectual level, but to not either take that personally nor to intend it personally, you know, back to him. Now, that said, there are cultures that are confrontational in both the intellectual and relational dimensions, and those tend to be African American cultures, as well as some others. But in the US, that's the predominant group that tends to be confrontational in both those areas. And there are also cultures that are confrontational in neither of those areas. Those tend to be Asian American and Native American cultures in the US. So here we have the European Americans in the middle here, who are shying away from intellectual confrontation and who are being confronted on the one side by cultures that are not confrontive in either dimension, and on the other side by cultures that are confrontive in both dimensions. It's a very interesting kind of mix, and one that leads to all kinds of difficulties in discussing important topics about living in a multicultural society, because we don't share the same communication style in the first place in being able to address the issues. At least being aware of it is a place to start. Let me draw your attention briefly to the values that are on the checklist here for intercultural communication. You will observe that these behaviors, the communication style, nonverbal behavior, and language use, are really tied into deeper value differences, the ways that we assign goodness and badness to ways of being in the world. That's what I mean by values. And you see that there are major cultural distinctions between individualism and group orientation, which I illustrated briefly on the board there. And related to this is the idea of egalitarianism, or thinking that everybody should be treated equally, as opposed to recognizing status. By the way, a related notion here is the idea that if we treat everybody exactly the same, that ensures fairness. This tends to be an American idea, that fairness is ensured if I treat you exactly the same way that I treat her. You see? It's called, sometimes based on equality. There are people who are exploring the idea that equality is not equity, that to actually be fair, I need to recognize that you're different than she is and treat you somewhat differently, you know, within the constraints of an organization, and that's the fairest thing to do, is to treat people differently rather than treating them the same. This is a discussion that needs to be occurring in our institutions, in our schools and others, where by and large the schools are set up on procedures that are based on the egalitarian equality notion that everybody should be treated exactly the same. And this may not be the way to ensure fairness in a society wherein people are in fact different and are claiming that difference. Do we solve problems? Do we just accept how things are? And I guess in general, are we mainly interested in getting ahead, or are we interested in getting along? These are major cultural differences, and again, our institutions tend to be set up to reward the people who value getting ahead and not to reward the people who value getting along, you see. So we need to be thinking through how are our institutions set up to reward learning, how are we approaching learning, all kinds of very, very interesting and serious questions that take into account the fact that we are and will continue to be different. Now, the last thing I want to mention to you in this afternoon has to do with the developmental, that last page, which is the developmental model. And I want to leave you with this idea. I want to leave you with the idea, and it's going to take me about 15 minutes to develop this idea, so don't get, you know, we're talking a long conclusion here, okay. Yeah. Maybe I'll do a little faster, we'll take a couple questions. But the idea here is that approaching the development of intercultural competence, as we call it, is not something that we sort of turn on or turn off. It's not that we come to a day or two or something and say, okay, well, we had our workshop on diversity, now we're all ready to go out and, you know, and treat people respectfully and with appreciation and you know, engage in this, you know, in this healthy marriage. On the contrary, this is a rather long and somewhat rocky developmental process, and that's what those stages are meant to indicate. It's meant to indicate how it is that people tend to go through their ability to deal with cultural difference. And briefly, the first stage suggests that people are in a state of denial about difference. They go, what difference? I don't see any difference. You know, even though the difference may be all around them, they say, I don't see it. Kind of like an alcoholic, same kind of denial that alcoholics are in when they say, I don't drink. I mean, even though anybody can see that they're drinking like a fish, you see, you know, that the person says, oh, I'm not drinking at all, see? And you want to say, well, that person's lying, but in fact they're not. They are incapable of seeing that difference. There's a way of thinking about this, is that they lack the categories, the cognitive categories for being able to perceive that difference. And so it's common in situations which are largely white, where people are largely in isolation from some cultural differences, certain ethnic differences anyway. It's common for people to be in denial. People in denial tend to look relatively benign. They say things like, live and let live. They have their ways. We know that there are those different people, and it's okay for them to be different as long as they stay in their place, as long as they don't come around us, see? And so we may set up circumstances to try to isolate ourselves or separate ourselves from this difference. It's a way of avoiding difference. Remember I said our natural tendency is to avoid difference? This is a way of avoiding difference by putting ourselves behind locked gates, by living in neighborhoods where we're surrounded by other people who are pretty much like us. These are all ways that we can try to hold off what we see as being this confrontation with difference. As people are forced into contact with difference, and this will happen increasingly in our society, as people are pushed into contact with difference anyway, they tend to go into defense. That is, they say, okay, I see it's different, and it's bad. This is the sort of negative stereotyping, superiority. The extreme forms of this are your white supremacists and your black supremacists, and all of the groups that are exalting the supremacy of their own group, and by the way, denigrating the other groups. This tends to be this form of defense. Now, there's a certain healthy aspect to this, which is it's an advancement over denial. It's better to be in defense than it is to be in denial. Why? Because in defense, at least the other people are human. You may not like them, but they're more human. In denial, the other people basically aren't very human. They're so out of your consciousness that it's kind of like, well, they're sort of, I don't know, part of the environment. And if they get in your way, well, you kind of kill them. The seeds of genocide, in other words, are in this denial. So it's a dangerous stage as well as on the surface, benign. But in defense, this is where you see this kind of nasty, overt behavior. We need to have some ways, and I've been discussing with the teachers, with one of the committees here this morning, ways that we can set up programs that will help people get through that. See, people have to deal with these issues, so we're going to try to get people through that defense and into this stage called minimization. And people in minimization look a lot nicer. They say things like, well, deep down, everybody's the same. I mean, I understand that on the surface people are different, but deep down, everybody's the same. It's a little bit like Small World. You ever been to the Small World exhibit at Disneyland? Or Disney World? It's a small world. There's a little boat. And have you ever noticed that the dolls all start out? They're all dressed in different costumes, in different colors, and they're all singing different languages. You notice that? It's a small world, and all of these different languages. And then you get to the end, and they're all dressed in white. And they're all singing in English. So you get the idea of what kind of small world we're talking about here. And then you come to the sign, sponsored by Bank of America. So I was in Japan one time to the Japanese Disneyland to find out that at the end of the Small World exhibit, this is research, somebody has to do it. At the end of the Small World ride, were all of the dolls singing in Japanese? Yes. Yes, they were. Yeah. So I think there may be sort of an inherent an ethnocentric position here around what I call minimization, which is this idea that if deep down everybody's the same, guess who is the standard for that sameness? People don't say deep down everybody's the same and they're all just like her. What do people say instead? They say deep down everybody's the same, and really they're just basically like, wow, that's right. That's right. So that's what makes it ethnocentric, even though those people look real nice. And it really is, actually is an improvement over defense to have those people say, well, we're all in the same boat. Except for, who doesn't like those people is largely people who have experienced oppression in a culture, in a society. This means many people of color in the U.S., tend to look askance at that stage of minimization. They say, it's kind of white liberal stuff, I'd rather deal with a redneck than a white liberal who is saying on the surface, oh, cultural differences, yes, 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 but deep down is saying, but I know you're basically just like me, When the person who is the minority in the culture knows perfectly well that they are not just like that person, you see. So the next stages are the stages that deal with accepting difference, dealing with difference. The first stage of acceptance is the one where we're saying, I see that this is different, and that's okay. Doesn't mean it's good. And let's be careful about that. The acceptance of cultural difference does not mean that you like everything. Sometimes people say, oh, that's cultural relativism. That means you don't have any judgment. That means that you have to like everything. That means, oh, it's from another culture. Well, it must be good then. Of course not. Of course not. Just because you recognize that there are different cultures doesn't mean that you suddenly lose your discrimination. It doesn't mean that you suddenly like everything in the world. It just means that you recognize that it's part of a culture. You see? And then, you could say, well, and I really like that culture, or I really don't like that culture, or I want to actually go out and join an organization that tries to help people in that culture who want to change. Give them some information that they could use to change some aspect of the culture. I personally don't think that we ought to go marching in like some imperialists and say, we're going to change your culture. But I think that there are ways that we can contribute resources to people in the culture who want to change. Because in every culture, people want to change, and we can do that. So you don't lose your judgment just by becoming a cultural relativist. By the way, you don't lose your principles either. Just because you recognize that cultures are different, that is, that things are relative to culture, doesn't mean that you don't have any values. It just means that your values are values that you are committed to. It doesn't mean that your values are written in some kind of, in some absolute stone. It means that you have considered alternatives to your values and are committed to those values. They could be religious values, could be other kind of values, but there's kind of a need to have thought about those values and having committed to them if we're going to believe in this kind of cultural difference. And I think that's an important thing to do. In adaptation, we are able to actually adjust our behavior. And let me address this for just a brief moment. What does it mean to adapt our behavior? It doesn't mean that this is all up to you to adapt your behavior to them. At the same time, it is not up to them to adapt their behavior to you. That this must become, in this multicultural society, a mutual process, a two-way process. That we constantly are going to be in a position of adapting to one another. So it's not that, for those of you who are teachers, it's not that the students in your classroom, that it's up to them to adapt to your style, but on the other hand, it's not totally up to you to adapt to their style. What we need to be doing is taking those students and helping them understand how to operate in whatever the school style is, as well as have the teachers go off and understand how to adapt their teaching methods to whoever it is that happens to be in the classroom. This should be going both ways. It's not absolutely one responsibility or the other. After all, we're all here. It's not like they came to our country. Who's us anyway that would be our country, you see. There's no real standard that says that everybody should adapt to this standard. It is that we need to learn how to get along with one another, and understanding this I think allows us to do that. Finally, I would say in what I call integration, we began to deal with the issues that are really the long-term issues, and that means, what does it mean to have an identity that is not tied to a single culture? What does it mean to be somebody who lives in a multicultural society? Does that mean that we have a multicultural identity? Does that mean that we have some other form of consciousness that we need to be operating with? My suggestion is yes. We do need to have some other form of consciousness, and the long-term development here is for us to learn how to become, not how to get rid of culture, but how to become more constantly aware of our own and other people's cultures as part of the communication and developing the society. And that's the way, I believe, that we can say to one another, we're better off together with our differences than we would be apart. Yeah, thanks. Thanks. There's a lot of stuff to do, isn't there, here? I mean, and you know, it's just the tiniest little bit of ammunition here, but I'm sorry to use the military metaphor there, but you know, this is just a little bit of information, but there's so much that we can learn about, and there's so many opportunities to do this, and the time is ripe right now for us to be doing this work. So, yeah, a couple. Somebody have a question you want to ask? You got to yell it out. Yeah.
How does this relate, let's say California, with that latest proposition
Yeah.
regarding Mexicans?
Right.
How does all this relate? Is this just a California issue, or is it an American issue, a U.S. issue?
Well, that particular form, of course, is, you know, people are upset about the immigrants, or what they perceive to be the cost of illegal immigration in California. I don't want to get into the politics of that particular thing. Let me say that overall in the country, there is a kind of reaction against immigrants. You know, and I think it's part of a defense reaction that diversity has reached the level in our society now that people are beginning to shift out of denial and into defense, at least in a lot of parts of the country. And that defensive response is taking the form of initiatives against immigrants and things like, you know, English only, you know, which is based on the mistaken assumption that immigrants are not learning English. And actually, the studies show that immigrants are learning English at exactly the same rate that immigrants have always learned English from the beginning when records were kept, which is the original the waves of European immigrants at the turn of the century and even earlier. So there mostly is not much data to support people's fears about what's happening with immigrants. It appears to be a defense reaction. I would say we're seeing the whole society kind of coming out of denial on this issue, and that we're going to see more of it before it's over. And part of our job now is going to be to figure out how do we deal with all these defense responses to people who are different and put it into a constructive context. Yeah.
A big thing right this time of year is how we deal with holidays in school. You know, we talk about celebrating diversity and appreciating diversity, and yet it seems to be eliminating diversity sometimes, you know, to do away with everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm just curious.
Yeah, and that is an interesting question, isn't it? That in the interest of not offending anybody, you know, we become, you know, so bland as to kind of, you know, get rid of all of the difference. I guess maybe we could do, again, you know, intelligent people are capable of holding two conflicting thoughts simultaneously. Let's take that, you know, take that definition. And if so, we ought to be able to hold the definition on the one hand of holiday, you know, like the holiday break. And on the other hand, say, and by the way, what is constituted in this holiday is Christmas, you know, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and any of a number of other celebrations which we could, you know, which we could put into that, and that we ought to be able to think about both of those things, in my opinion, you know. And if we want to refer generically to the holiday, then let's call it holiday. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about, you know, what the specific things are, you know, that we're actually celebrating. See, it's just two ideas simultaneously. It's not hard. These things are not at war with one another. See, we always think that unity and diversity are at war with one another, but on the contrary, au contraire, they're not at war with one another. Unity and diversity complement one another. That the unity, like the unity of holidays, you see, is one dimension, and the diversity of the specific celebrations that go into that different people celebrate at holiday season is the diverse dimension of that, and these two things work together. Listen, you guys have all been very patient to be sitting so long, and thank you for letting me develop these ideas with you.